in at least the English of it, in the chat, so there will be different ways to access the text that we're looking at together. My name is Ebn Leader. I've been a student of my teacher, Art Green, for the past 20 years. Although my first teacher was David Hartman of blessed memory in Jerusalem. And for the past 15 years or so, I've been teaching at the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College in Boston. I don't know if anybody here had the chance to see the discussion last night between Arthur Green and Dr. Stephanie Casa, a scholar of Buddhism and ecology. At the end of when they had very interesting and important things to say about the way our religious experience can interact with our environmental concerns, but at the end of this talk, Art made a call to all people to join, or to people who are inclined towards ritual, to join a very old practice that he had revived in the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College some, I think maybe a couple of years ago, of reciting Ma'amadot. This particular practice, reciting Ma'amadot, is an old practice. As he says, he told it goes back to the temple times, in which every day the section from the first chapter of Genesis, which describes the creation of the world, for that day is recited. So on Sunday, the description of God saying, "Let there be light" on the first day is recited. On Monday, day 2, God saying, "Let there be a firmament that separates between the upper waters and lower waters" is recited. On Tuesday, the text where God separates dry land from ocean is recited, and so on and so forth. Every day, one of the sections of the creation story is recited, and it culminates on Friday night with the ritual of Kiddush, of sanctifying the day, where over the full cup of wine we say, "And then the work of heaven and earth was completed, and God rested on the seventh day." And he talked about sort of the theological context and his understanding of theology and of the theology of evolution, and why it would make sense to revive this practice, which had mostly fallen out of use in Jewish, and definitely in the liberal Jewish communities, but in most Jewish communities over the years. And although we had not planned it that way, my project for today is to talk a little bit about this ritual, about this idea of reintroducing the story of creation back into our regular liturgical life on a regular basis beyond what is already there, and sort of think about what it means for religious life, for religious people, for religious consciousness. What are the kinds of buttons that it pushes, or the things that it makes possible? So that's the project for today. I'm going to do some history and some contemporary stuff. My hope is to look a little bit at the historical background of how this ritual develops. I'll stop for questions at different points along the road, and then look a little bit at the way it's practiced. I hope we will have time. It's sort of a look at the text of the way it's practiced today at the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College, and sort of think about the ways that is the same and different from what came before it. So that's the plan for today. This particular practice is unique in the sense that its roots are in temple practice. And we need to stop take a little time to think about this notion of temple practice, because it is really very, very different. Temple or temple practice is very, very different than anything that we generally think about in terms of our Jewish practice today. If we think back to the temple periods, and let's say you're thinking about the period from sort of when the tribes of Israel sort of start living in the area that we now call the land of Israel, let's say until the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, that gives you a little over a millennia. That's from about the 13th century before the Common Era, the 12th century before the Common Era, until the 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era. So it gives you 1,000, 1,200 years or so. The thing, Israelite tradition is what we would call an indigenous tradition. And I'm not saying indigenous, I'm not trying to make a political claim here. This has nothing to do with politics. When I say it's an indigenous religion, what I mean is it's a religion and a culture that grows in relationship to a particular physical geographic location and sees itself rooted, impacted, and being part of that particular physical location, and sees its religious life and its ritual life as being part of that location. So if you think about sort of indigenous cultures that we may be more familiar with, let's say like Native American cultures or such, right? They are deeply connected to a particular place. It is the song and the ritual that goes along with the sun rising and the sun setting. It is the ritual and the song that keeps the cycles of nature going around, because that's how they work, right? Because there is a deep sense practice is connected to place and to the natural cycle of place. And through practice and ritual, personal identity is connected to place as well. And we have been living, for the past 2 millennia as a people in exile, as a people who wandered. So it's almost hard for us to understand or to think about our religion to be the same as this Israelite religion, whose basic premises were somewhat different. So if you look, for instance, at, I'm going to start with a really, really famous text. It's from Pirkei Avot. It's the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, which Fred has already put in the chat, and I'll put it for 1 minute here on the shared screen, which I do not have permission to do at this point because participants' screen sharing has been disabled. We will try again in a second.
Wait. Wait. There we go.
No,
okay.
Still.
No, should work.
Okay, let's see. Oh, there we go. Good. Thank you. Okay, let me find this here. No. Oh, that's interesting. Why am I not finding it here? That's strange. 1 second. Oh, here. Okay, this should be where it is. I'm sorry. Excuse me for this. Here we go. Sure. Yes, here we go. So a very famous and well-known text, Shimon HaTzadik Hayam Misharei HaKnesset HaGedolah. This is after Pirkei Avot has tracked down the history of a sort of, it has created a story of transition from Moses down to its own time. And it says, Hu haya omer, he would say, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omer. There are 3 things on which the world stands and establishes. Al Torah, al avodah, al gmilut chasadim. Right, there are 3 things that hold the world, that keep the world from collapsing: Torah, avodah, meaning the temple service, and gmilut chasadim, sort of the practice of kindness, which is then further articulated in Avot Rabbi Natan. What does it mean to say that the world is dependent on avodah, on the service of the temple. As long as the service of the temple exists, the world and all its dwellers are blessed. The rain comes in its time, as it says, to serve la'avah et Adonai Elohechem lovdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem. But when the service of the temple does not exist, the world and its dwellers are not blessed. The rain does not come in a timely fashion. Right, as it says, right, Yishamru lachem b'charaf Adonai b'chem, and so on. That is to say, we often think of these, we read this text and we have it immediately, oh, that's a punishment and reward kind of thing. You do the right thing, you're going to get the prize. You're going to do the bad thing, you're going to get a punishment. But there's a deeper sense in which what this text is doing is reflecting, sort of, it's at the tail end of the indigenous period of Israelite religion. It's reflecting a consciousness of the natural cycles are dependent or are related to the way we live our life. And blessing will be in the world if we enact our rituals. But that means that we have to think about our rituals insofar as they connect or are part of a natural cycle. And the natural cycle is not abstract. It is not, oh, we do something in the universe, which is, again, as an exilic people, the way we would have most often thought about this. It is very specific to a very specific place. So again, we're looking now at the Talmud. When a person lives in the land of Israel, it is like they have a God. But one who lives outside of the land, it is as if they did not have a God. For it says, Latet lachem et eretz Canaan, liot lachem le'Elohim, to give you the land of Canaan and to be a God for you. So the relationship, the religion doesn't make any sense outside of the specific geographical, physical location in which it is born and created. Said even more explicitly in Sifrei, in an early Tannaitic midrash, describing the curse of going out into exile. You will soon perish or be lost in the land, therefore set these words upon your heart, in which then this is God speaking, despite the fact that I am exiling you from the land, mark yourself by the practice of mitzvot, so that when you come back, they will not be new to you. Thus Yirmiyahu says, make markers for yourself. This verse refers to the mitzvot that mark the people of Israel. It's a striking, and even for us, a shocking text, because its primary assumption is that outside of the land of Israel, the whole system of commandments, of mitzvot, is meaningless. That my assumption would be that once I am no longer living on the land to which my practice is connected, to which my religion is connected, from which my spirituality has grown and developed, and into which it pours, there would be no point in doing any of these practices anymore. And so God has to show up and say, you're right. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for you to do any of these practices once you leave the land, but keep on doing them anyway. Why? Because one day you're going to come back, and I don't want you to have to relearn everything all over again. Right? Make markers. It's a reminder. Right? Now, there's developed the thing we call Judaism, right, is mostly developed in a diasporic consciousness, which is very different than the indigenous consciousness reflected in the text we're looking at today. But from the perspective of these texts, the fact that we are continuing to do the practice on other lands, on geography, in watersheds that have not created this practice, really does not have any meaning except for connecting us to a past and to a future in which our practice could be connected, again, to a specific piece of land. Now, again, there's a really interesting contemporary question to be asked about what does it mean to have a tradition that was indigenous, that became diasporic, and here we are in the 21st century wondering about the ways we can reconnect to earth and consciousness and environmental consciousness and so on and so forth. But I'm going to put that question aside for a moment and just say it is important to realize when we talk about temple practices, what are we actually talking about? And the ways in which indigenous practice, indigenous Israelite religion is deeply connected to the cycles of nature and time and of identity, understanding one's own identity, personal and national, in context to a geographic reality, as opposed to the Jewish identity that we have developed in the diaspora. So we're going to move back into the diaspora thing in a little while, but for a moment, I just want to stop here and just understand this starting point for our discussion. I think this might be a good point to stop for people's comments, reflections, thoughts, confusions, annoyances, etc. It's a little hard for me to see everybody because you're spread out on two screens. So maybe if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you could put your name, just type your name into the chat, and then Fred will see it and call out with a great voice to, so you can voice what you wanted to voice.
Naharia, then Shana.
Wait, I'm going to switch to speaker view so that I actually see the person who's talking.
Okay.
Hi, so this is Naharia. I don't understand why the ketubot thing saying to give you Canaan, to be a god to you, limits God to Canaan.
The way the text is reading it is that these two are dependent on each other. You could read the verse in other ways, but the way the particular Talmudic text is reading it, sort of as a proof text for the idea that anyone who lives outside of the land of Israel is as if they don't have a God, the way the text is reading, the way the Talmudic text is reading the biblical text is as if it is two clauses dependent on each other. That is, I will give you the land of Canaan, and then, and only then, and only under those conditions will I be a God to you. And it's not the only possible way. You could have read that verse. There are other possible ways you could have read it, but that's the way it's being read by this particular Talmudic move, which is a reflection of a very different kind of consciousness.
Right? Why would rabbis of the Talmud choose to read it that way? Or are these still in Israel? These sages.
Where the tradition comes from or not is that's in the messiness of teasing out the history of our texts, which are mixed up of all sorts of times and places and such. But I think we have to read this, as there are, of course, in the Talmudic literature, there are strong statements of people who are all for diasporic Judaism and having Babylon have primacy over the religion in Israel and so on. But this, I would say, when I look at the different texts and say, oh, what kind of tradition you're reflecting, I would say this particular text is indeed reflecting the remnants of the indigenous consciousness that was there. And it would stand in conflict with other texts in the same book, as a matter of fact, on the same page of that Masechet on Ketubot 110, and with the Bavli, it stands in conflict with other opinions that say, no, the religion of Babylon takes primacy over the religion of Eretz Yisrael. So there's a discussion and clash coming out here, and I am not trying to enter that particular argument, but at this point, just to show the existence of this particular trend, because it's the one this practice is going to connect to. But it's it's there in conversation with other and conflicting readings as well.
Thank you.
Sheena?
So I also have a question about conflict and balance. How when the temple's destroyed, so you don't have the temple anymore, what do you take with you? What do you leave behind? What do you say that only belonged to the temple and I can't take it with me? And what do you need to take with you? In Masechet Ta'anit, it says certain things you just have to leave behind. That's only happened at the temple, and you can't bring it with you. So how do you balance what to take and what to leave?
Right. I mean, that was the big question of the first century of the Common Era. It's
Right.
beginning to look like it's the big question of the 21st century of the Common Era. You will remember the most famous story, sort of the most widely known story that sort of puts that into, puts your question into like full on head-to-head clash, right, is the story about Tenli Yavne B'Chachamea. What do you choose, right? When you see that the destruction is going to come, what do you ask Caesar for? Not Caesar yet, but in the story becoming Caesar, right? What do you ask the Roman for? Do you ask for something new, different, not connected to land? Or do you ask to preserve the temple? Because without the place and the land, there's nothing left. And so if you look, you've asked, what is the archetype of that clash as it's described in that tradition? It's that famous story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And we are the heirs of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We are the heirs of the one who decided, I'm going to ask to save Yavne and its scholars. I'm not going to ask to save the temple. I'm sorry if this is an insider's conversation, if not everybody remembers that story. It's a well-known story from the Talmudic literature about the destruction of the temple and about a certain rabbi who had the chance to make one request from the Roman general. And he had to decide whether he was going to ask to preserve the scholars or preserve the temple. And he chose, and in this Talmudic story, he chooses the scholars. And some of his colleagues are very angry at him about it. But that's the story. Right? It's precisely the question that you're asking.
So with that, we return to the scholarship. B'vakasha.
Good. Okay, let me move back to where I can see more people. Good.
Texts are going in the chat box and the link is there as well.
Okay. Although he is really not looked on with much acceptance in today's comparative religion field as an academic field, Eliada is very helpful in understanding sort of some of the basic premises of this kind of religion, sort of a land-based area, part of natural cycles. And it can be very helpful to see his explanation about how in most such cultures, there's a notion of the place we live as being the center of the universe or the center of the cosmos, and everything else building around it, and the center of the cosmos being the holy place where we all come together. And that's where we do the rituals that uphold the cosmos, because it is that center place. And you're probably familiar with the tradition that the temple in Jerusalem is built on Even Hashtiyah, or the foundation stone, or the stone that is the center of the world and upon which the universe is founded. And the mosque in Jerusalem is said to be over that same stone today. And so every indigenous culture has a center of the world. And the temple itself as a holy place, again, not something we have in the same way. Our temples or synagogues follow very different models. They are more wandering, changing, moving things, but this temple at the center of the universe serves as the place where you can hold all the different pieces together. And to see an expression of that, right, we again go to in this case, a somewhat later rabbinic text, but I only went to the later one because it was nice and short, and there are much longer, more developed versions of this in earlier texts. And I just listen to this story. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shalom said, we find that the Mishkan, right, which is the predecessor of the temple, is equivalent to the creation of the world. On the first day, heaven and earth were created, of which it says, God stretches the sky like a tent cloth. And of the Mishkan, it says, you shall make sheets of cloth to cover it. On the second day, it says, let there be a firmament to separate, right, the waters above and the waters below. And in the Mishkan, it says, a curtain will separate between the different parts. On the third day, it says, let the waters be gathered. And in the Mishkan, it says, make a laver, put in it water, people wash their hands in it. On the fourth day, it says, let there be lights. And in the Mishkan, it says, make a candelabra and light lights in the world. On the fifth day, it says, there shall be birds who fly through the air. And in the Mishkan, it says, the cherubs spread their wings, right? These are the figures who are over the Holy Ark, who spread their wings and cover it from above. On the sixth day, it says, let the earth bring forth living creatures, which ultimately leads to the creation of humanity. And in the Mishkan, it says, when a person brings a sacrifice. The seventh day was all light. And when God entered the Mishkan, it would glow from the divine presence. Right. So here what you have is a structure. That is, you have an architecture in which, in the mind of the person coming to the temple, right, the temple, the sacred place, the place of ritual, the place we hold, is a microcosmos. It is everything that is there in the universe, the sky, the earth, the animals, the light, they all have to be represented in some way in the temple, in the sacred place, in the place where we come to do the ritual. Because our ritual is deeply and inherently connected to the place in which we live and to the natural context in which we live. It is connected to the rain coming down, to the birds flying around. Right? If not for my covenant being kept daily, the cycles of heaven and earth would not repeat themselves. That's Tanakh. Right? That's Tehillim. Right? So there's a sense, there's a deep sense, right? We most often think of religion and ritual. The question we ask is, oh, what does it change within me? Right? When I study Torah, how does that change me? When I say a prayer, how does that change? Right? What does it do to me, to my relationships with people, to the things I'm doing outside? Indigenous religion, or Israelite indigenous religion, sees every religious act, I don't know if every religious act, but sees its basic religious acts as being part of the cycle of nature, of being part of upholding those cycles. And part of that is held in architecture, in structure, just in consciousness, and part of that is actually ritualized. And the part that's actually ritualized is sort of the last classic rabbinic text that we're going to look at today, which is a very interesting text, which Shana, you mentioned Ta'anit, you will be familiar with it, which becomes the basis ultimately for the ritual that we're talking about today. And I'm going to read this one a little more slowly than the others and just pay more attention to some small details in it as we go through it. So the Mishnah just prior to this has discussed the fasts and the mourning at the destruction of the temple. It's a wonderful Masechet. It's about nature and rain and the calamity of not having rain and how destruction comes in there. And not surprisingly, and I would say probably partially as a indigenous memory, it also becomes a Masechet, that the part of the Mishnah that talks about ritual and temple ritual and how it functions. And it says this is the beginning of the last chapter of the tractate. And it says, there are 3 times a year that the priests raise their hands in blessing 4 times a day. Okay, usually it happens twice, maybe 3 times a day. It depends how you read it. But there are 3 times a day. Like for us, that sounds very rare. We know the priests do their blessing, on holidays a few times a year. In Eretz Israel, in Israel today, the practice is people do it every day. Priests do it every day. But in the temple, this is a description of the temple. In the temple, the priests raise their hands in blessing 4 times a day in 3 different settings. The four times a day were in the morning, that is when the morning offering was brought to the altar. Musaf, it is when a additional holiday offering was brought to the altar. When the evening or afternoon offering was brought to the altar, and at the closing of the gates. Right? You have to remember the temple was also built on a solar outlook. There's sun people. There is no temple service at night. The temple opens at sunrise, closes at sunset. Our whole idea that days start in the evening is a later northern Babylonian thing we picked up. At temple level, we're still a sun people. So the 4 points at which the priests say a blessing, raise their hands to bless the people, with the morning offering, that is the first offering of the day, the additional offering for the holiday, the afternoon offering, which is the last sacrifice of the day, and at the locking of the gates for the nights. The 3 times this happens, which are not 3 times, but 3 categories of time. It happens on fast days. It happens in something called the ma'amad, the ma'amadot, which which literally means standing there or being present. And it happens on Yom Kippur. Okay, on those 3 times, the priest bless 4 times a day. Now, the Mishnah itself feels the need to explain what this thing called ma'amad is. And in order to explain what this thing called ma'amad is, they tell a history story. And they say that the Torah says, command the children of Israel to bring my daily offering. Right, they quoting the text from Numbers, but it appears a couple of other times as well. The point that's important to them to be making here is that there are 2 daily offerings brought in the temple. Every day there's 1 offering brought in the morning, 1 offering brought in the evening. And those offerings are communal offerings, which is to say they do not come from any individual, but rather they are a commandment to the children of Israel. That is, all of the Israelite people together as a community bring the morning offering and the afternoon offering every day. To which the Mishnah has an interesting question. How could a person's offering be sacrificed without her presence? Right? Since there's no way that the entire community is standing every morning and every afternoon at the temple to be there for the offering of the daily offering, what does it even mean to say it comes from the people? That is, the Mishnah is reflecting a consciousness and an understanding that for somebody to offer a sacrifice to God requires presence, right? The person has to be present. But that is, of course, so it would then follow that if the whole community is making an offering to God, the whole community needs to be present. That's physically impossible. Physically impossible. So what do? To solve this problem, the ancient prophets established 24 shifts. Each shift includes a presence, a ma'amad, of priests, Levites, and Israelites. When it was that shift's, there should be an apostrophe on that S. When it was that shift's turn to go to Jerusalem, the priest and the Levites went to Jerusalem, and the Israelites of that shift gathered in their towns and recited the story of creation. So they solved the problem of presence by representation, right? They divide the whole Jewish people, so to speak, right, or Israelite people, into 24 different groups, each group including the 3 categories of people: the priests who actually do the work in the temple, Levites who do supportive work in the temple, and the Israelites, which is all of us. Each of these groups includes these 3 categories of people, and there are, because there are 24 of them, that means that you do 2 cycles every year, right? You have each group, each shift, each mishmar is responsible for 1 week in the temple. And for that 1 week, which happens twice a year, for that 1 week, that particular group of people is the representative of the entire community in the temple. So every week, there's a particular group, sort of, our priests go to the temple, offer the sacrifice. Our Levites go to the temple, open the gates, sing the songs, do all the things that the Levites do. And we, for our week, we gather in the towns and we recite the story of creation. Because that is an essential part of what the work in the temple means. The ritual of the temple is about keeping the story of the creation of the world going. Human beings have a role in the universe, in the cosmos, which in this time of history is understood as a religious responsibility. And our role is to keep the energy of the story of creation going around. So what does it mean to be responsible for the service of the temple? It means that there'll be some people who will be doing offerings, some people who will be singing songs and cleaning up, and some people who will be telling the story of Masechet Bereshit, the story of creation. Right? And so from this, right, you have and then this is developed elsewhere, sort of explaining that the way these recitations happened was the way I described earlier, of on the first day reading the story of the first day of creation, on Monday reading the story of the second day of creation, and so on through the week. But at least in the understanding of the Mishnah, that is part of the definition of what it means to hold, to be responsible for the service of the temple. Next break for questions at this point. Rim, are you saying something? Come on, I'm not that convincing.
Questions can also go in the chat box. I will note that we are at 4:40 for what that's worth, and there's some beautiful ma'amadot ahead. Eben, if you can make the text a little wider so it fills the screen, then people can read it better.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Here we go. Is the ma'amadot made up, or is it a projection, or do we have historicity for it?
Okay, that's a good question. That's a good question. Here's the thing. At least we have continuity for it. Even if we don't, it's hard to say we don't have first century BCE prayer book for Ma'amadot, which lists the different parts to say every day. We have these texts which come, within, give or take, within a century sort of the temple itself existing. For the Mishnah, for the Tanaitic text, it's a question, which come earlier, which come later, but you can say we're within a century of the temple actually existing, and you have continuity from that point, that is where things become very interesting, because let's say a historian like Urbach discovered these old texts from the 5th, 6th, 7th century, in which people had a practice of reciting every week one chapter from the Mishnah of Shabbat. It so happens that the tractate of the Mishnah dedicated to Shabbat has 24 chapters to it. And alongside each chapter, alongside the chanting of each chapter, comes also the name of the particular family of priests that was the shift of that week. So you have very early on, you have a remnants of this practice existing in archaeological findings. That is, not from the temple period, but that a few hundred years afterwards, there were still communities who were still holding the memory of the practice of that kind of year cycle, that the year is divided into 2 24-week cycles, and that each cycle, each week is devoted to a different priestly family. And they had lists of the names of which families was the learning of that week of Mishnah dedicated to. So there's a lot of continuity in this. I would say probably the texts we're looking at now, these Tanaitic texts, or the one we're looking at and a few others about it, are probably the earliest written texts we have for it. And I say they come, within 50, 100 years or so of the existence of the temple. But there is, after that, a continuity of the practice that goes on. What happens then, a couple of centuries later, like by the period of Hasidei Ashkenaz in the 11th and 12th century, you already have developments of this ritual. And then there are sort of interesting developments, which I won't spend a lot of time on today, in which a lot of other texts get added on. It sort of becomes, like Jews have this tendency, once you have a piece of liturgical text, you immediately add more and more and more on it until you end up with an 800-page high holiday machzor instead of something that a person could actually say. So the same thing happens with everything. And so in the 12th century, you already have like this really long, elaborate daily ritual of chanting Ma'amadot that would have taken, a good hour out of your time, which is probably one of the reasons it doesn't really survive as a regular practice either. But there's a continuity to the practice and to the memory of it. So like, that's about as close as I can say to, did somebody imagine this? Like, its roots are really close to the actual happening, and there's a continuity of the memory.
Nice. Might be a similar answer to Shemitah's own historicity, and lots of talk about that as well in these coming days at the Climate Fest. Next test and the link coming up.
So that's what you have, right? You have this old story of something that happened in the temple, and you had a history of it sort of being recited by different communities in different contexts and different times. And you have it falling out of use over the generations. That is, there are very few people today in the Jewish world across the range, like from ultra-Orthodox to humanistic or whatever, secular, whatever the range of Jewish practices are. There are very few people who actually practice chanting the Ma'amad every day. It is not a common practice at all. And that probably has to be thought about in the context of the larger question of what our primary story is. Like, what is our primary story of identity? And it's probably true that as we became a diaspora people, our origin stories became much more our national origin stories than our cosmic origin stories. That is, you ask, what is our founding story? It's probably easier for us to think of it as, oh, our founding story is there was Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca, and then the people were slaves in Egypt, and then we got redeemed from Egypt, and we received Torah. Like, those are our foundation stories. I mean, it's foundational to the extent that the first Rashi commentary on the Torah, when we start the book of Genesis, the first Rashi asks, why do we need this? Like, why is this an important story at all? We should have started in the book of Exodus, where God begins a relationship with the people of Israel and gives the first mitzvot and gives the foundational. That's the first commentary of Rashi on the Torah. The first verse is, what do we need this story for? And then he gives some reason of what you need the story for. But I'm not so interested in Rashi's answers. I'm interested in the consciousness that it reflects, which is that our primary foundational identity story is not the story of Genesis. It's a story of the people, the wanderers, Egypt, slave, coming out of Egypt, relationship with God, receiving Torah. That's our foundational story, not the story of the creation of the world. But if you think about a community whose main practice is reading the story of the creation of the world, right, there's a shift in what your foundational story and your foundational sense of identity is. So as we became less and less connected to specific place, to specific land, to land-based practices, we lost our sense of, oh, what we are doing is part of the natural cycles of the existence of the cosmos. We also lost the importance of the story of creation as a foundational identity story. So the practices, it made sense for the practices that were focused around that story to sort of fall by the wayside as well. And here we come into the 20th century, right? And in the 20th century, we have this new challenge in which we discover that we have been given the power to make this planet unlivable for the human beings that live on it. Right? And we have to look, and this is a long, and in that sense, I really am continuing the conversation from last night, which I'm not going to do the whole conversation now, but there's a real sense that religion has an important role for those of us who engage in it. And I would say probably for many people in the world at this point, has an important role in shaping consciousness. And if we don't reshape our consciousness and who we are in our imagination, then we are going to continue doing what we're already doing, and we're going to make our planet unlivable. And so one of the things my teacher, Art Green, has been pushing for the past couple of decades is the centrality, reclaiming the centrality of the creation story as a foundational identity story. Not instead, like not to drop the Egypt national people thing. We're not going to throw that out the window. We're not going to stop eating matzah and Pesach or any of those, but to at least reclaim alongside that identity story, the story of, oh, we are a people who live in the world, whose practice should be oriented towards these cycles of living in the world, towards a natural cycles, towards the sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening, towards the rain clouds coming, the wind blowing, the water falling down, the rivers flowing. Right? That should be part of our identity forming stories. For art, a big part of it, or so what he talked about last night, a big part of what he talked about was telling that story, telling it regularly, telling it constantly, helps refocus our consciousness towards the light of divinity. Calling the world created rather than existing helps focus our consciousness to the awe and wonder of everything that we're seeing, and to not take the world as granted, and to be able to see it as a miracle. I would say for myself, retelling and going back to the creation story is very much the challenge it poses for me is, oh, like, can I reclaim something of that kind of old Israelite consciousness in my own life of saying, oh, the things I'm doing, the practices I'm practicing, the spiritual work I'm engaging in, you know, that's like a tree is growing, the wind is blowing, the lizard's running across the grass, and I'm doing my practice. Right? Are there ways in which I can change my consciousness about what it means to be a Jewish religious practitioner that'll make me understand myself more in the context of the natural world rather than separated from it? So for the past, I think, I don't know, now it's, at least 2, 3, 4 years or something. The practice has been at the rabbinical school to just read that, to just every day at the end of morning services, to read the section from the Torah of that describes the creation of that day, which is a funny thing because it's a pluralistic rabbinical school. So you have different versions of prayer happening every day. And oftentimes you come in and you don't even know what's going to happen and something. And the one consistent, in a way, they know at the end of prayer, there's going to be Mourner's Kaddish and there's going to be Ma'amad. Like those are the two things that are going to happen at the end of the service. And so when we started doing this a few years ago, I wrote a short intention for this practice, which is the last piece of text I'm going to share today. And it touches on some of the things that I think that in my understanding sort of make this a meaningful practice for us today where we are. It follows the formula, it follows the old Kabbalistic formula of stating intentions before doing any ritual act. Sort of the, it's one of the things that would actually be also interesting for us to think about more widely. There is sort of a very old Kabbalistic tradition of before engaging in any act, articulating in words, what am I doing? How am I going about this? What is my goal? What do I hope will happen from this? And so this is a tradition. It's the most common form of such intentions, usually begin with the phrase, Hashem yichud kudsha b'richu v'shchinte. That is, I am doing this for the sake of unifying the Holy Blessed One and the presence. And if you look at this, oh wait, here, I'll put it on the screen. 1 second. Share. Okay. Fred, is that wide enough or is, because it's spread?
If you have a screen or on the touchpad and can kind of diagonal it, we'd be able to see it better. It's also English only is in the chat box as well.
Maybe if I make it larger, did that help anything?
Not
Because
really. It became larger within the same column.
Because
no worries.
All right, because it spreads across, maybe if I knock this out, it spreads across the whole screen on my computer. I'm not sure why it doesn't on the other one. But can you see the text?
No worries. Thank you.
You can see the text? Yeah, okay. So the first section is pretty much a traditional introduction. It is, what am I doing this for? I am doing this for the sake of unifying the Holy Blessed One in its presence, in fear and in love, to unite the divine name Yud-He with the divine name Vav-He in complete unity on behalf of the people of Israel and on behalf of all creatures above and below. We could spend a lot of time on each one of the elements of this, which I'm not going to do because that's sort of an intro to a lot of basic framework of Kabbalah thinking. But I'll just say like a few small things, al regel achat, as we say, on one foot, right? The Holy Blessed One and the presence, right, are usually understood as the way God is present in what is, that's the presence, and the way God is present in possibility and what could be, right? And our role in life is to try to bridge the gap between those two, to bring together what is God as God is present and what is, to bring that together with until it is united with God's presence as what could be. That is, yichud kudsha b'richu and shchinte means that's where we live. We live on that ongoing project of trying to bring those two together, because they're both manifestations of God, they're both manifestations of the divine, that we're trying to bring them not to be so different from each other. That is, that which is and that which could be. Right? It is not an intellectual project, it's a deeply emotional project in which we engage with sort of the primary catchwords for emotional engagement are fear and love. They create a binary kind of the ones we like or afraid of, the emotions of putting distance in vis-a-vis the emotions of growing closer. I'm going to ignore for a second the next unification of Yud-He and Vav-He in complete unity on behalf of the people of Israel, which is very standard in saying you don't pray for yourself. Like Isaac Luria said to his students, you should know you're standing in prayer is because you're together with your friends. Like only as part of something greater can you stand in prayer. You always have to ask yourself whenever you stand in prayer, how am I part of something greater? So the traditional beginning of the orientation says, yes, I am asking for myself, and I'm asking on behalf of all of Israel. And in our present consciousness, I added the next phrase as well. That is, I expanded that sense of belonging, of being part of something greater, not just being part of the people of Israel, but on behalf of all creatures above and below. Right, so that's that's a classic Kabbalistic statement of intention, which then goes into the details of this particular practice. I pause to recite the story of whichever it happens to be, the day I'm reciting, right, the first day, the second day, the third day, of creation, which is part of the greater story of creation, all made of one, a weave in which every part is connected and none is ever lost. The whole sequence of phrases, of Hebrew phrases used in this sentence, all come from the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. And so this is going back, this is where the liturgy takes us back to the story we saw before of, oh, the place, my sacred place, the place in which I stand in holiness and offer myself, that is the place of the world. And the ways in which the tabernacle comes together, is woven together, it all becomes one whole. That's reflected in the world. That's what I need to see in the universe. I need to see the universe as one woven together, each part connected. Right? So that's a consciousness orientation for the Ma'amad. And may the merit of reciting the Ma'amad allow me to hear the voice that echoes through the world daily, saying, observe all that I have made, how beautiful and wondrous all my creations are. Pay attention that you do not ruin and destroy my world. Right, and that section is a combination of two different classic rabbinic texts. One which tells the story of God taking the first Adam to the garden and telling him these words. That is, this is a quote from that probably 3rd or 4th century Midrash, when God takes the first Adam to the garden and says, look, observe all I have made, how beautiful it is. Do not ruin and destroy the world. And that's the meaning, that's sort of the Midrash playing out the biblical statement that God put Adam in the garden, the Obadav l'shomra, right, to care for and preserve it. But it's mixed with another classic rabbinic tradition that says that there are these voices that call out to people every day from Sinai and say, like, are you doing what you need to do in the world? And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, said, well, if these voices are calling out from Sinai, why doesn't anybody ever hear them if they're being called out every day? And his answer is, you do hear them. Whenever there's a moment of conscience that awakens in you, what you're hearing is that voice coming out from Sinai. So this part, or this paragraph, right, is expressing the hope that through this recitation, right, I will internally be able to hear that voice, right, the voice calling on me to see the beauty and the wonder, and to understand that it is my responsibility not to ruin and destroy it. And may I merit being counted among those who construct and not among those who cause damage. And may I merit to hear the voice that proclaims, say to Zion, you are my people, not just my nation, but those who are truly with me, those who partner with me in creation of heaven and earth through speech. That's a Zohar that plays on the words, Lihyot imi, amiata, you are my people, which if you change the vowels of the Hebrew word, ami, my people, becomes imi, together with me. And the Zohar reads it as God calling out to humanity to be partners. right? Not just to be, the people who live under the king, but to be my partners in the creation of the world, right? In the creation of heaven and earth through speech. And now we go back to a really traditionalist kavanah. May my reciting of this ma'amad be effective, as if I had recited it with the proper care and attention to all of the details and attention, and to the 613 practices that depend on it, because once everything is a weave, one piece depends on all of the others, for they are all connected to it. Amen, Selah. And this is Norman Fisher's translation of the verse from Psalms, Vihi Noam, light my path with your beauty, that all I do is inspired. Yes, establish my life in you, and let all that I do be yours. And then following that, one reads the section, the story of the creation of that particular day. So that's the contemporary practice, and that's the history and the background and the orientation of that particular practice. And that was Art's call last night, sort of for people to adopt this practice of the Ma'amadot really as a way to shift our own sense of identity and what our foundational story is, sort of to help create the new imagining of self that will actually allow us to change in the ways we need to change if we are going to be able to keep this planet inhabitable by humans. Your turn.
Fantastic Torah. We have a few more minutes together. Kol hakavod, hamon toda. Anne and Rim ask whether the text that you wrote for the Ma'amadot practice, with all of its rich allusions to tradition, is itself printed anywhere with its own hyperlinks. On Sefaria, it's one text, but it could be its own subject of text study.
If you want, I will send you the annotated version of that. There's a footnoted version I'll send you.
I think everyone here would love that.
Let me think if I can do something quick with that. Could I do something quick with that? I don't know. We'll have to figure it out somehow what to do with that. Yeah.
Okay. Stay tuned. Look up Sefaria and
I could put it on. I could put on a Sefaria actually. You could look for it under my name, and I'll put it on Sefaria. That's not a bad idea, Fred. I'll put it on Sefaria, and you can find it under my name.
Okay. Bli neder, but it would be wonderful. Thank you. Questions, please. While we wait for people to formulate, I'll just note that the last text, I believe, was Psalm 90, Davka, which is about our mortality and common in funerary contexts. And there's something incredibly powerful and literally grounding, me'afar le'afar, about having the final note here be that what we do matters, but it matters in a very finite context up against Kudshabrihu Shinte, which is in the realm of the infinite. And that level of humility of Anava is itself something very important to ground a larger ethic of taking up our right amount of space within creation.
Nice, thank you.
I have one comment and question. There's no text in the Bible that causes greater conflict and controversy with science than the creation story. I mean, I think that's truism in the 21st century. And I know that in Art's book, Radical Judaism, he encourages modern Jewish thinkers to embrace science. And I think that, do you think that's an important thing to incorporate into this practice?
Yeah, Yeah, I think in that sense, I would say I am definitely an art student, and it doesn't make sense to me to be fighting, like, 18th century arguments of the church with science. Like that, we finished that. Like that battle's done. Like, the question is not, oh, is the scientific reading correct or is the biblical reading correct? Like the question is, what are the ways in which the scientific reading adds truth and meaning and significance to our life, and what are the ways in which the biblical stories adds truth and significance and meaning to our life? And they can do it in tremendously complementary ways, but they're not doing it in exactly the same track. Like what Art spoke about at great length last night, and most of it from radical Judaism, about the ways in which he thinks the story of evolution should itself be reread as a religious story and sort of taken as a mythology that we work with on the premise of the awe and inspiration and beauty of the creation story, sort of like to reread evolution as its own mythical creation story. But totally, like it's one of the weird, I think, in my personal opinion, manifestations of some kind of a neo-fundamentalism that has sort of like suddenly revived some of these 200-year-old arguments and made them like the central religious issue. Like, I really don't think that argument is a central religious issue. It's like, been there, done that, seen the movie, got the t-shirt, ready to move on.
Nice. If we're moving on to action, I just wanted to make sure we said before 5:15 to thank everyone for being part of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Festival, where there is a lot more Torah still to unfold in the next 3 days or so, literally over 100 yet to go. So please return to jewishclimatefest.org and take advantage of that range. And then plug in from the prayer and the limud, the study, to the ma'aseh, to the action, through the whole network that Hebrew College itself is doing so much programmatically, and other seminaries and groups that are connecting us to the places where the action is happening, whether it's in the Jewish realm, dayenu.org, Chazon, Kojal, Jewish Climate Action Network, Jewish Earth Alliance. There are so many wonderful ways to get involved. And of course, interfaithpowerandlight.org and Green Faith and the other multi-faith initiatives, which this text points in some beautiful ways toward that level of engagement as well. So please stay connected. And as people need to leave, they certainly may.
And thank you so much, Fred, for so ably and wonderfully holding this vessel so we could actually do the whole thing together. It really makes a big difference. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you, Evan.
Okay.
Thank you, Evan.
Okay. We can say this is over, but if you have a few more minutes, then
Yeah, Eben, could I ask one question? This is Rabbi Dvorlin in DC from Jewish Earth Alliance, and I wanted to say I've always been astonished. Your explanation of why this is not the Genesis is not our foundational story was really poignant for me, and I've always wondered why there hasn't been more of a recognition or a celebration of how actually close our creation story is to what we believe now actually happened. That if we say let there be light is let there be electrons, and also just the Luria Big Bang, and it's astonishing to me. Is it divine inspiration? It is divine inspiration, and no one seems to talk about that regardless of how long a day was, the sequence of events is darn close for people who lived, quote, without science, who lived 4,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago.
Thank
So
you.
I'm mystified by that lack of attention to that.
Yeah, I think part of it might just be that once you acknowledge that that the scientific story and the sort of mythical story are addressing truth from different aspects of a human being, then the similarities can be interesting, intriguing, opening up in a way. They're not crucial. Like they bring out, they said, wow, that's really fascinating. And it sort of, maybe it makes it easier for somebody to bring them together and to feel like, oh, all the truths in my life are actually, like merging with each other in interesting ways. But I think there's also not the necessity of, oh, this has to work together. And if it doesn't work together, it's going to be a tragedy. Because if it doesn't work together, then it will be indeed addressing different aspects of truth of my human life. So I think that might be part of the, part of why that particular aspect is not that central. It is, by the way, it is central, I think, to people usually on the thin line of stepping out of orthodoxy or out of ultra-orthodoxy. Sort of as people move along that line, the question of, can I make these two really work together, I think often has more of a crucial sense than for somebody, I would say, like myself, who, like I said before, sees like, it's okay, like I'm okay with these being two stories that are addressing truth from different places. But
Well, those who have a background in anthropology and evolution and biology and all that.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to, think of another culture that has a story that is so close. And I can't.
Yeah, but I did say, like I said before, like for me, the more striking thing is that since when we became a diaspora people, we sort of left creation as a foundation story and went to the exiled from Egypt wanderers story as our foundation identity story. For me, like that's actually a crucial difference and distinction.
Yes.
At the point of our
Yes, that made terrific sense to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. Yes.
So you mentioned that this has become part of, along with the Kaddish, something that happens at Hebrew College regularly. And what I'm wondering about is participating in this over time in yourself or noticing within your fellow daveners, how has that changed you?
Let's see, who do we have here? Eric, you see, this is now me getting like into my annoying teacher mode and seeing a Hebrew College rabbinical student sitting here. And I said, well, let's ask somebody who has walked in this community, discovered it as a practice, right? This started before your time, didn't it, Eric?
It's funny. Hold on just a second. This is Ezra.
Hi, Ezra.
Hello. I came to Hebrew College, and this is the only experience that I've had at Hebrew College. So the funny thing is, when I got there and when I feel like I was really coming into formal davening space for the first time, I just figured this is what it was like everywhere. So I know no other way to do it. In fact, when I go, God willing, COVID will pass soon. Like this again, when I go home to my family in Tennessee and I daven with my father, this is what we do. So I don't know any other practice now.
Yeah, okay, all right. That knocks my my question off. Thanks, Eric.
Right.
Um,
Well,
I think like any other practice, it has impact insofar as it's part of a larger web of practice, thinking, working. Like, I assume if that was the, you know, the one thing I was doing, like, okay, I'm going to say these, you know, 2 or 3 verses from Torah every morning. I don't know, like, what or how, what kind of impact it would have to do. But I would say it creates connections and associations in my life with other things that I'm doing and with other parts of consciousness. It becomes like another point where strings come together and sort of things coalesce, and oh, that makes sense. So it becomes a meaningful part of a weave. I don't know if I can evaluate it sort of like independently, sort of outside, as if it was only one thing. But I will say it has become a significant part of the sort of weave of practices of my learning and my teaching and my liturgical practice. It's sort of like, oh, look, like these different things fit together and they sort of try to make something come together. Like, in that sense, I would definitely say it's been meaningful.
Evan, do you mind if I add on as your student, just to come back to, you're calling me out here? You know, I think ecological consciousness is certainly a part of it, having learned this practice from you and from Art. And for me personally, and this may reflect some of what you just said, I think there's definitely a sense of, you know, you talked earlier in this, and I've heard you mention many times about, you know, when you are getting involved in a practice, it has to move you in some, you know, in some form or fashion. And I think this is certainly the same. And so there's certainly a consciousness as a result of going through the process of tefillah and being aware that we're part of a greater network. There's certainly a consciousness that everything that I've just said in my davening makes me one part of a greater whole. So there's an awareness as I'm going through not only the davening, but also setting forward into the work of the day, that everything I'm doing is not just for me, the student sitting there, but in fact, I'm doing this as my small part of influence in the world that I inhabit.
nice. Your fellow Bostonian Rabbi Tobias Spitzer is working on a book on metaphorical theology and the power of framing that includes the very names that we use for Hashem and the difference between Mayim or Eish or Tzur as opposed to Adonai or Melech or Av. And that we have this incredibly rich toolkit. Similarly, we have all these beautiful traditions. And if you choose to recite Ma'amadot compared to the other pieces of liturgy that you might either ancient or modern incorporate into daily or weekly practice, it's part of that larger frame. And the frame actually creates its own reality, although it's of course a dance, right? We were motivated to create this frame, and then the frame keeps us going. Yeah. And how lucky for you, Eric, to say this is my normative Judaism, right? Just like Ezra, you're lucky to have Torah like this as the background chatter while you play. That's pretty cool.
You remember over the summer when we did more davening together, we also said some of the creation story? You remember that? Now I'm putting you on the spot. No.
Okay, all right, we'll call it a night.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all so much.
Great.
Good night and end of Tu B'Shvat Sameach to everyone. The last moments of Tu B'Shvat. Bye, Fred. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.